She stepped onto the bus, a figure so unassuming she was practically invisible. Just another weary soul heading home under the flickering fluorescent lights of the city's circulatory system. Her simple gray tracksuit was worn at the cuffs, and her hair was pulled back in a simple, unadorned ponytail. She carried a plain canvas bag slung over her shoulder, its contents a mystery to the world. To the handful of passengers scattered throughout the vehicle, she was nobody of consequence, a quiet woman who blended into the worn vinyl seats and the graffiti-etched windows. But they had no idea who she truly was. They couldn't see the years of discipline etched into her calm posture or the quiet power coiled in her relaxed muscles. The three young men who swaggered onto the bus at the next stop certainly didn't. They saw only a target, a soft, silent woman who wouldn't cause a problem. What happened next left everyone speechless. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The city air was thick with the day's leftover heat, a damp blanket that clung to the skin and made every breath feel like a chore. Elena felt the familiar ache in her muscles, a deep and satisfying thrum that spoke of hours spent on the tatami, the woven straw mats of her dojo. It was a good ache, a reminder of her purpose, but it left her feeling drained, her social armor worn thin. She just wanted the quiet solitude of her small apartment, a cup of tea, and the company of a well-worn book. The bus was a necessary evil, a metal tube that rattled through the veins of the metropolis, carrying a cargo of tired workers, dreaming students, and the restless spirits of the night. She found a seat near the back, a strategic choice that offered a clear view of the entrance and exit, a habit ingrained from decades of training and awareness. The world, her master used to say, is your first dojo. You must learn to read its rhythms, to anticipate its movements, before you can ever hope to master yourself. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the jerky motion of the bus lull her into a state of semi-awareness. A placid lake of thought that was easily disturbed but quick to settle. The faces of her students swam in her mind's eye, the young boy who finally mastered his breakfall, the teenage girl who found a new confidence in her stance, the middle-aged man who used his judo practice as a moving meditation to quiet his anxious mind. These were her triumphs, the quiet victories that mattered far more than any medal or trophy. She was a shaper of character, a teacher of the gentle way, a philosophy that emphasized yielding to overcome force, of using an opponent's aggression to bring about their own downfall. It was a principle she applied not just on the mats, but in every facet of her life, a silent creed that guided her through the often chaotic dance of human interaction. She sought harmony, not conflict, balance, not dominance. This evening, however, the world was about to test her resolve, to see if the principles she taught could withstand the raw, unfiltered aggression of those who knew nothing of the gentle way, those who saw kindness as a weakness to be exploited, and silence as an invitation to attack. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of stale perfume and diesel fumes, and settled herself for the journey. A lone island of tranquility in a sea of urban unrest, completely unaware of the storm that was rapidly approaching her shores. She was a master of a forgotten art, a warrior cloaked in the mundane, and the stage for her unwanted demonstration was now set. The doors of the bus hissed open with a pneumatic sigh, and three figures stepped aboard, their laughter sharp and jagged, cutting through the weary quiet like shards of broken glass. They did not pay their fare. They simply pushed past the driver with an air of entitled ownership, as if this public conveyance were their own private kingdom, and its inhabitants merely serfs to be toyed with. The driver, a tired man with weary eyes who had seen too many nights like this one, merely shook his head and looked away, choosing the path of non-confrontation. It was a small surrender, but it ceded control of the space, and the trio of young men drank in that power like a fine wine. They were a study in aggressive mediocrity, draped in logos that screamed for attention, their movements exaggerated and loud, designed to occupy as much space as possible, both physically and orally. The leader, a wiry young man with a cruel twist to his lips, called himself Marco. He moved with a predator's swagger, his eyes scanning the bus not for a seat, but for a source of amusement, a target to alleviate the boredom of their empty lives. His two companions were his shadows, larger in build but smaller in will, their laughter a constant echo of his own. They were a pack, and like any pack, they sought to establish their dominance through intimidation and fear. Elena watched them through lowered lids, her body still, her breathing even. She had seen their type 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different places. They were a common weed in the garden of humanity, thriving on the fear and apathy of others. Their brand of aggression was loud and brittle, a hollow shell that concealed a deep-seated insecurity. She knew this, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a fundamental truth of human dynamics, learned through years of observing conflict in its many forms. Her training was not just about throws and holds, it was about understanding the human heart, the motivations that drive a person to build themselves up by tearing others down. She felt a flicker of pity for them, a fleeting sadness for the path they had chosen, but it was quickly replaced by a quiet vigilance. She had no desire to engage, but she was prepared for the possibility. Her mind a calm and calculating engine, assessing angles, distances, and potential threats with an effortless precision that was as natural to her as breathing. The bus lurched forward, and the three men stumbled, their feigned nonchalance broken for a moment. They laughed it off, but their eyes were now fixed on her. The quiet woman in the corner who had not flinched, who had not looked away, who simply existed in their space without acknowledging their perceived authority. To them, her stillness was an affront, her silence a challenge. They saw a sheep, and they were wolves, ready to play their cruel and predictable game. The initial target was an elderly man seated near the front, a frail figure with a newspaper trembling in his wrinkled hands. Marco leaned over him, his voice oozing with mock concern. "What you reading, Pops? The obituaries? Looking for your name?" His two friends roared with laughter, a canned and obnoxious sound that filled the confined space of the bus. The old man shrank in his seat, his face pale, his eyes darting around for help that he knew would not come. The other passengers became a study in urban invisibility. They sank deeper into their coats, their gazes fixed on their phones, on the dark windows, on anything but the unfolding ugliness. They were not cruel people, but they were afraid, and their collective fear created a vacuum in which the bullies could operate with impunity. This was the ecosystem of public harassment, thriving on the silence of the majority. Elena watched, her heart heavy with a familiar disappointment. She understood their fear, but she also knew that fear was the soil in which aggression grew. Each averted gaze, each silent retreat, was a small victory for the likes of Marco. After they grew bored with tormenting the old man, their attention drifted, and like a compass needle finding north, it settled on Elena. She was the nail that was not hammered down, the one person who did not seem to shrink from their presence. They began to move towards the back of the bus, a slow, deliberate procession of menace. They were not walking, they were prowling, their movements a theatrical performance for the captive audience. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Marco's voice was a low sneer, intended to carry. "Looks like someone forgot to get dressed before leaving the house." He gestured towards Elena's simple tracksuit, a garment chosen for comfort and practicality, but which in his eyes was a symbol of weakness, of a lack of status. "This bus has a dress code, you know," one of his friends added, his voice a dull echo of his leader's. No pajamas allowed. The humiliation had begun, a slow and steady drip of verbal poison, designed to isolate and degrade her. Elena did not respond. She simply met their gaze, her expression unreadable. She did not offer them the fear they craved, nor the anger that would justify their escalation. Her calm was a mirror, reflecting their own ugliness back at them. And they did not like what they saw. It enraged them. They craved a reaction, a tear, a plea, anything to validate their power. Her refusal to provide it was a denial of their very existence. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Marco leaned closer, his personal space violation a calculated act of intimidation. The sour smell of cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke washed over her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the tense energy of a predator about to strike. She remained perfectly still, her spine straight, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind of activity. She was aware of the exact distance between them, the angle of his approach, the shifting of his weight onto his front foot. She saw the way his friend was subconsciously positioning himself to cut off her exit. They thought they were cornering a rabbit, but they had stumbled into the den of a sleeping lioness. The other passengers were now acutely aware of the drama unfolding. They stole furtive glances, their faces a mixture of fear and a grim, detached curiosity. Among them was a young woman, a university student with a textbook open on her lap. Though she wasn't reading, she was the kind witness. Her eyes met Elena's for a fleeting second, a silent exchange of solidarity and helplessness. The student's expression was one of genuine concern, a small beacon of humanity in the suffocating darkness of the moment. She wanted to say something, to intervene, but the fear was a physical thing. A hand clapped firmly over her mouth. Her presence, however, did not go unnoticed by Elena. It was a small reminder that not all of humanity was lost to apathy, that decency still existed, even if it was cowed into silence. This small connection fortified her resolve. She was not just defending herself, she was standing for everyone on that bus who was too afraid to stand for themselves. The confrontation was escalating, the air thick with unspoken violence. Marco, frustrated by her stoicism, decided to up the ante. He reached out and flicked the collar of her tracksuit with his finger. "This is for a certain class of people, you know. People who have respect for themselves. People like you don't belong here." The phrase hung in the air. A classic line from the bully's handbook. It was a judgment, a verdict delivered by a self-appointed king on his throne of cheap plastic. He was trying to define her, to put her in a box labeled victim. He was about to learn, in the most direct and unforgettable way possible, just how wrong he was. He had mistaken stillness for fear, silence for submission, and simplicity for weakness. It was a fatal miscalculation, a mistake he would have the rest of his life to regret, a lesson that would be administered not with anger or hatred, but with the cold, undeniable physics of the gentle way. The first physical contact was a test, a probe to gauge her reaction. When she did not flinch or cry out, Marco grew bolder. His sneer widened, revealing a row of stained teeth. He saw her composure not as a sign of strength, but as proof of her terrified paralysis. To him, it was inconceivable that a woman, especially one dressed so plainly, could be anything other than a helpless victim in waiting. He was the star of his own movie, and in his script, she was the damsel in distress, albeit one who was not playing her part with enough dramatic flair. He decided a little more motivation was in order. He gestured to his two hulking companions, who moved to flank her, effectively boxing her in against the window. The message was clear, there was no escape. The other passengers, who had been stealing glances, now looked away completely. The situation had crossed a threshold, moving from verbal harassment to the immediate threat of physical violence, and the collective denial was a palpable force. They were not here. This was not happening. Elena, however, was very much here. Her senses were heightened, the world slowing down to a crawl. She could hear the frantic beat of the young student's heart across the aisle. She could smell the fierce sweat of the man in the seat in front of her. She could feel the vibration of the bus's engine through the soles of her worn sneakers. Her mind, far from being paralyzed, was a sanctuary of absolute calm. It was a state she had trained for years to achieve. A mental space where emotion was set aside, and only strategy and technique remained. She was not angry. Anger was a cloud that obscured judgment. She was not afraid. Fear was a weight that slowed the body. She was simply present, a vessel of pure potential, ready to channel a lifetime of training into a single, decisive moment. "I think you owe us an apology," Marco said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You've been disrespecting us with your silence." It was a twisted piece of logic. The classic abuser's tactic of blaming the victim. He was painting her as the aggressor, her refusal to be intimidated as an act of defiance that required punishment. "And I think," he continued, reaching for the canvas bag at her feet. "You should pay a fine for your bad manners." This was the final line. The bag contained nothing of monetary value, just a change of clothes, a water bottle, and a well-worn copy of the Book of Five Rings. But it was her property, her space, and the violation was absolute. As his fingers brushed against the canvas, the placid lake of her composure was not disturbed. Rather, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable ripple. She moved. It was not a sudden, jerky motion born of panic. It was a fluid, economical shift of energy, as natural and unstoppable as the turning of the tide. Her left hand came up, not to strike, but to gently cup his descending wrist. Her fingers found the precise pressure points, the small gaps between the bones. It was a touch, not a grab. Yet it carried with it the weight of 1,000 hours of practice. Marco froze, a look of confusion on his face. He tried to pull his hand back, but it wouldn't move. It was as if his wrist had been caught in a vice made of soft skin and unyielding will. He was strong, his muscles corded from preening in front of a gym mirror. But his strength was useless. It was like trying to punch water. He tugged harder, his confusion turning to a flicker of alarm. "What the?" he began, but the word died in his throat. With a subtle rotation of her hips and a slight extension of her arm, Elena applied the principles of kotegaeshi, the wrist outturn. It was a classic judo technique, elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effect. It did not rely on strength, but on leverage, on redirecting an opponent's own force back upon themselves. A wave of searing electric pain shot up Marco's arm, from his wrist to his shoulder, overloading his nervous system. His fingers uncurled from her bag, his knees buckled, and a choked gasp escaped his lips. He was forced downwards, not by a push, but by the undeniable logic of his own anatomy being used against him. He landed on the grimy floor of the bus with a pathetic whimper, his face a mask of shocked disbelief and agony. The entire exchange had taken less than 2 seconds. It was so fast, so quiet, that at first, the other two bullies didn't even process what had happened. They just saw their leader suddenly kneeling on the floor, as if in supplication. Then they saw his face, contorted in pain, and their slow minds finally caught up. Their expressions shifted from smug arrogance to dumbfounded shock. They had come to shear a sheep, and had found themselves face to face with a wolf who had just broken their alpha without breaking a sweat. The second antagonist, the larger of the two shadows, reacted on pure instinct. His brain, incapable of complex analysis, defaulted to its most basic programming. When confused, use brute force. He let out a guttural roar, a sound meant to intimidate, and lunged towards Elena. He was a mountain of a man, his arms thick as tree trunks, and he threw a clumsy, telegraphed punch aimed at her head. For a trained fighter, it was like watching a freight train approach in slow motion. For Elena, this was not a fight, it was a physics problem, and she was an expert in the field. She didn't retreat from the attack. She moved into it, closing the distance. As his fist sailed through the air where her head had been a moment before, she pivoted on the ball of her left foot, her body a whirlwind of controlled motion. Her right leg swept out in a low, graceful arc. This was Dishi Barai, the forward foot sweep, one of the foundational techniques of judo. Her foot connected with his ankle at the precise moment his weight was transferring forward, the exact point of maximum instability. It's a technique that requires timing, not power. A child could topple a giant with it if the timing was perfect. And Elena's timing was perfect? The man's leg was simply not there to support him. His forward momentum, which he had intended to be the source of his power, became his undoing. He was a falling tree, his arms windmilling uselessly as gravity. The ultimate master claimed him. He crashed onto the floor of the bus with a thunderous boom that shook the entire vehicle. He landed flat on his back, the air driven from his lungs in a pained whoosh. He lay there, dazed and gasping, looking up at the stained ceiling of the bus as if trying to understand how the sky had suddenly become the floor. The entire bus had fallen into a stunned, absolute silence. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, Marco's pathetic whimpering on the floor, and the big man's desperate gasps for air. The remaining antagonist, the third member of the trio, had been a half-step behind his friend, ready to follow up. He stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He had just witnessed the complete and effortless dismantling of his two formidable friends by a woman he had dismissed as a weak and easy target. His entire worldview, a simple hierarchy based on physical intimidation and brute strength, had been shattered in the span of 5 seconds. He looked at his friends, defeated on the floor. He looked at the other passengers, who were now staring openly, their faces masks of astonishment. And then he looked at Elena. She had not even broken a sweat. She stood calmly, her center of gravity low, her hands slightly raised in a posture of readiness, not aggression. She was not looking at the two men on the floor. She was looking directly at him. Her eyes were not filled with anger or triumph. They were calm, clear, and steady. But in their depths, he saw a power he could not comprehend, a strength that was not of the muscles, but of the spirit. It was the unwavering gaze of someone who had faced down her own fears 1,000 times on the training mats and had emerged victorious every time. That gaze told him everything he needed to know. It told him that if he took one more step, he would suffer the same fate as his friends, only faster. His bravado, the cheap and brittle armor he wore every day, cracked and then disintegrated completely. Fear, cold and pure, flooded his veins. He did the only thing his terrified mind could think of. He took a step back, then another. He raised his hands in a universal gesture of surrender, his palms facing her as if to ward off an evil spirit. "I don't want any trouble," he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. The words were a bitter irony, the same ones Elena had spoken to them just minutes before, though they sounded very different coming from his lips. Elena simply held his gaze for a moment longer, a silent assertion of control, and then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The unspoken message was clear: the conflict is over. I will not harm you if you do not force me to. The young man, trembling, continued to back away until he bumped into the rear door of the bus. He fumbled with the handle, his eyes never leaving her, and practically fell out onto the street as the bus, whose driver had finally pulled over to the curb, came to a complete stop. He scrambled to his feet and ran off into the night, disappearing into the darkness, a coward fleeing a battle he never understood he had already lost before it even began. The bus was a frozen tableau of shock. The driver, a portly man named George with a graying mustache, had been watching the entire scene unfold in his wide-angle mirror, his foot instinctively pressing the brake. He had seen countless acts of petty thuggery on his route, but he had never seen anything like this. He had witnessed a quiet, middle-aged woman in a tracksuit neutralize 2 aggressive young men who outweighed her by 100 pounds each, with the grace and efficiency of a ballet dancer. He fumbled for the button on his console, the one that sent a silent alarm to the transit authority and the local police department. It was a button he had pressed many times before, usually with a sense of dread. But tonight he pressed it with a feeling of profound respect. In the aisle, Elena stood over the 2 defeated men. Marco was still on his knees, cradling his wrist, his face pale and slick with sweat. The other man was now pushing himself into a sitting position, his bravado gone, replaced by a look of dazed confusion. Elena looked down at them, not with triumph, but with a quiet disappointment. "The gentle way," she said, her voice calm and even, though it carried the weight of authority throughout the silent bus, "teaches that we do not fight to harm, but to protect. It teaches that true strength is not the power to dominate others, but the power to control oneself. You left me no choice but to demonstrate the difference." Her words were not for them alone. They were for everyone on the bus, a lesson delivered in the most practical terms imaginable. The other passengers were slowly coming out of their shock, their faces shifting from disbelief to awe. The young student, the kind witness, was looking at Elena with wide, shining eyes, a look of pure hero worship on her face. The elderly man who had been harassed earlier was sitting up straight, a small, triumphant smile on his lips. They had all been victims, in a way, held captive by the trio's aggression and their own fear. Now, they were liberated, not just by Elena's actions, but by the powerful message she had sent. One person, armed with courage and skill, could stand up to the darkness and win. The distant wail of a siren began to cut through the night, growing steadily closer. The sound seemed to break the spell. Marco looked up at Elena, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. The pain in his wrist was nothing compared to the dawning realization of his complete and utter humiliation. He, the self-styled king of the bus, had been brought low by the very person he had judged to be the weakest. His entire identity was built on a foundation of perceived strength, and that foundation had just been pulverized. Who are you?" he stammered, the question a genuine plea for understanding. Elena simply looked at him. She did not need to answer. The flashing red and blue lights that now bathed the interior of the bus in a strobing, psychedelic glow were answer enough. The vindicators had arrived. 2 police officers boarded the bus, their expressions grim and professional. They were met with a scene that was both confusing and clear at the same time. 2 large young men were on the floor, one nursing an injury, the other looking dazed, while a calm woman in a tracksuit stood nearby. Their professional instincts immediately sized up the men as the likely aggressors, but the situation was still unusual. "What's going on here?" the senior officer asked, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Before the whimpering Marco could spin a tale of being assaulted, several voices spoke up at once. "They attacked her," the young student exclaimed, finding her voice at last. "They were harassing everyone," chimed in the elderly man. "They started it. She was just defending herself," another passenger added. A chorus of agreement rose from the previously silent witnesses, a sudden and powerful wave of communal truth. The officers listened, their experienced eyes scanning the scene, taking in the relieved faces of the passengers and the guilty, fearful expressions of the 2 men on the floor. The senior officer, a man named Sergeant Miller, then looked at Elena. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with a flicker of recognition. He was a veteran of the force, with 20 years on the street, and he had a memory for faces. He had seen her face before, not on a bus, but on a poster, in a newspaper, on the local news. He took a step closer. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now laced with respect. "Aren't you Elena Vance, the 2-time Olympic medalist? You taught the defensive tactics seminar for our department last year." The reveal landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the bus. The name resonated with a quiet authority. Elena Vance was not just a local hero, she was a legend in the world of martial arts, a woman renowned for her incredible skill and her dedication to teaching judo as a path to self-improvement. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for everyone. The calm demeanor, the simple clothes, the quiet confidence, the shocking and effortless display of skill. It all made sense now. She wasn't just some random woman, she was a master, a black belt of the highest order. Marco and his friends stared at her, their faces draining of all color. They hadn't just picked on a random woman. They had threatened a celebrated Olympian, a judo master revered by the city's own police force. Their terror was now complete. They were no longer just bullies who had been put in their place. They were criminals who had assaulted a civic treasure, and they were about to face the full consequences of their actions. The arrest was a quiet and efficient affair. Marco and his dazed companion offered no resistance, their fight completely extinguished. As the officers cuffed them, their earlier swagger was replaced by a slouched, pathetic posture of defeat. They avoided looking at Elena, unable to meet the gaze of the woman who had so thoroughly and completely dismantled their world. They were read their rights in a monotone voice, the familiar words a stark and formal end to their reign of petty terror on the late-night bus route. Sergeant Miller personally took Elena's statement, his pen scratching across his notepad, though it was more of a formality. The testimony of a dozen grateful passengers, combined with his own recognition of her, made the case an open and shut matter. "I've seen the security footage from these buses before," he said to her in a low, respectful voice. "I have a feeling this one is going to be required viewing down at the academy. You did a good thing here tonight, Miss Vance. Not just for yourself, but for everyone on this bus." Elena simply nodded, a hint of weariness in her eyes. "I just did what my training prepared me for, Sergeant," I prefer to resolve conflict, not create it. Her words were simple, yet they carried a profound weight. She had not sought this confrontation, but she had not shied away from it. She had met aggression with tranquility, force with technique, and hatred with a calm, centered resolve. As the two men were led off the bus, their heads bowed in shame, a spontaneous round of applause broke out among the remaining passengers. It started with the young student, the kind witness, and quickly spread. It was a heartfelt, grateful sound, a release of the tension and fear they had all felt. They were not just clapping for the physical feat they had witnessed, they were applauding the restoration of order, the victory of decency over brutishness. Elena, a woman who was uncomfortable with public accolades, gave a small, shy smile and a slight bow of her head, a gesture of respect she would have given in her dojo. She was not a hero in her own eyes. She was just a practitioner of a discipline that had, once again, proven its worth in the real world. The young student approached her, her textbook clutched to her chest like a shield. That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen," she said, her voice filled with awe. I've always wanted to learn self-defense, but I've always been too scared." Elena looked at the young woman and saw a familiar spark in her eyes, the desire for strength, not to harm, but to feel safe, to walk through the world without fear. "Fear is a natural response," Elena said, her voice kind. "But it doesn't have to control you. The first step in any journey is the hardest, but it is also the most important." She reached into her canvas bag, retrieved a pen, and wrote a number on a small torn piece of paper from the student's notebook. "This is the number for my dojo. We have a class for beginners. You would be most welcome." The student took the paper as if it were a precious artifact, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. In that moment, a new path had opened up for her, a possibility she had never dared to consider. The seeds of positive change, planted in the ugly soil of conflict, were already beginning to sprout. George, the bus driver, came back to where Elena was standing. "On behalf of the transit authority, and just from me, thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We see a lot of bad stuff on these late shifts. It's good to see the good guys win for a change. A real win." The bus, once a stage for humiliation and fear, had been transformed into a space of communal gratitude and inspiration. The shared experience had bonded the disparate group of strangers, turning them from isolated individuals into a collective, a small community forged in the crucible of a shared threat and a shared deliverance. The comeuppance for Marco and his friend was not just their arrest, it was their utter and complete exposure. Their power, which was based entirely on the illusion of strength and the currency of fear, had been revealed as a sham. They were not wolves, they were just scared boys, lashing out at a world they didn't understand. Elena had not just defeated them physically, she had stripped them of their false power, leaving them with nothing but the pathetic reality of their own insecurity. And in doing so, she had empowered everyone else, showing them that the quietest person in the room might just be the strongest. The journey home was far from over, but the most difficult part had passed. The rest of the ride was completed in a warm and companionable silence, the air no longer thick with menace, but with a shared sense of respect and quiet wonder for the unassuming woman in the simple gray tracksuit. The story of the bus judoka, as the media quickly dubbed her, became a local sensation. The security footage, released by the transit authority, went viral, and Elena Vance became an overnight, albeit reluctant, celebrity. News outlets celebrated her as a hero, a symbol of female empowerment, a real-life superheroine who fought for the common citizen. They focused on the dramatic takedowns, the David and Goliath aspect of the story. But for Elena, the incident was not a victory to be celebrated, but a problem to be solved. She saw the fear in the eyes of the other passengers, the rampant aggression of the young men, and the systemic issues that allowed such confrontations to happen in the first place. She knew that a single act of self-defense, no matter how skillful, did not solve the underlying problem. It was a symptom, not a cure. The legal proceedings against Marco and his associate were swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the clear video footage and the testimony of a dozen witnesses, they pleaded guilty to assault and public disturbance. The judge, a stern woman who had seen the video herself, was not lenient. But instead of simply sentencing them to jail time, she listened to a surprising advocate who appeared in the courtroom on their behalf, Elena Vance. She stood before the court, not as a victim seeking retribution, but as a teacher seeking an opportunity. She argued that prison would only harden these young men, that it would teach them nothing but how to be better criminals. What they needed, she explained, was not punishment, but discipline. They needed to learn respect for themselves and for others. They needed to channel their aggression into something constructive. She made an extraordinary proposal, a reduced sentence, contingent on their mandatory enrollment in a new community outreach program she was establishing. A program that would use the principles of judo to teach at-risk youth discipline, empathy, and conflict resolution. The judge, moved by her plea and her progressive approach to justice, agreed. It was an unorthodox solution, but it was one that offered a genuine path towards redemption, not just retribution. Thus began the next chapter of the story, a chapter that moved from the violent climax on the bus to the quiet, patient work of rebuilding lives. The program was called The Gentle Way Forward, and Elena poured her heart and soul into it. She secured a space in a rundown community center, the very one she had attended as a child, and with the help of donations that poured in after her story went public, she transformed it. She laid down new tatami mats, hung scrolls with calligraphy spelling out the core principles of judo, Seiryoku Zenyo, maximum efficiency, minimum effort, and Jita Kyoe, mutual welfare and benefit. Her goal was not to create fighters, but to build better human beings. Marco and his friend were her first and most challenging students. They arrived at the dojo sullen and resentful, their presence a condition of their probation. They still saw her as their adversary, the woman who had humiliated them. But Elena treated them with the same respect and patience she showed all her students. She did not mention the bus incident. She simply taught. She taught them how to bow, a gesture of humility and respect for their partners and their training space. She taught them how to fall, over and over again, until they learned that there was no shame in being thrown, only in refusing to get back up. She taught them the intricate dance of throws and holds, a language of leverage and balance that had nothing to do with brute strength. She taught them that the goal was not to crush your opponent, but to control the situation with the least amount of force necessary. It was a slow and arduous process. The two young men were resistant at first, their egos bruised, their minds closed, but the discipline of the dojo began to work its subtle magic. The daily routine, the physical exertion, the quiet moments of meditation at the end of each class, all began to chip away at their hard exteriors. They began to see the strength in yielding, the power in control. They started to listen, not just to her instructions, but to the philosophy behind them. They were learning that respect was something you earned through your actions, not something you could demand through intimidation. The true transformation was not physical, but mental and emotional. It was a long and difficult road, but inch by inch they began to change. Months turned into a year, and the Gentle Way Forward program flourished. It became a sanctuary for dozens of kids from the neighborhood, a place where they could escape the harsh realities of the street and find a sense of purpose and belonging. Elena was no longer just a judo instructor. She was a mentor, a counselor, and a pillar of the community. She taught them that the discipline they learned on the mats could be applied to their schoolwork, their relationships, and their future careers. She showed them that there was a different kind of strength, one that did not require a loud voice or a threatening posture. The most profound evidence of her success was Marco. He had completed his mandatory community service, but he had not left the dojo. He was now one of Elena's most dedicated students. The wiry, sneering bully from the bus was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused young man who moved with a newfound sense of grace and humility. He was still strong, but his strength was now tempered with control. He was the first to arrive at the dojo and the last to leave. He helped the younger students, patiently guiding them through their first awkward attempts at a foot sweep, teaching them how to tie their belts, and explaining the importance of bowing. He had found a new identity, not as a predator, but as a protector. One evening, after a particularly rigorous training session, Marco approached Elena as she was cleaning the mats, a task she always did herself, believing that a master should never be above the most humble work. He bowed deeply, a gesture of profound and genuine respect. "Sensei," he said, using the formal title of a teacher. His voice quiet and steady. "I have wanted to say this for a long time. What I did on that bus, it was wrong. There is no excuse for my behavior. I was a weak person trying to act strong. I am sorry. For what I did to you and to the other people on that bus, thank you for not giving up on me. You didn't just teach me judo. You saved my life." Elena stopped her work and looked at him, her eyes filled with a warmth that was far more powerful than any rebuke. "I did not save you, Marco," she replied gently. "You saved yourself. I only showed you the door. You were the one who had to walk through it. The path of judo is a lifelong journey. I am proud to walk it with you." In that moment, the cycle was complete. The act of violence on the bus had not ended with an arrest. It had ended here, in a quiet dojo, with a sincere apology and a heartfelt expression of gratitude. The comeuppance had transformed into redemption. The antagonist had not just been defeated, he had been healed. This was the true meaning of the gentle way. It was not just about winning a fight. It was about turning an enemy into a friend, transforming a moment of conflict into an opportunity for growth, and leaving the world a little more balanced than you found it. The systemic change didn't stop there. Inspired by the success of Elena's program, the City Council and the Transit Authority worked with her to implement new initiatives. They started funding similar programs in other community centers across the city. The Transit Authority overhauled its driver training, implementing new de-escalation and emergency response protocols. They also launched a public awareness campaign featuring Elena Vance herself, with the simple but powerful message, "Respect is a two-way street. Let's travel it together." The bus where the incident occurred was quietly recommissioned. On a small, discreet plaque near the back, where she had been sitting, a new inscription was added. It did not mention her name or the fight. It simply read, "In this space, a lesson was taught. True strength is gentle." It was a quiet, unassuming tribute to a quiet, unassuming woman who had reminded an entire city that you can never, ever judge a person by their appearance, and that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single, courageous stand on a late-night bus. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you misjudged someone based on how they looked? We all do it. It's a mental shortcut, a way our brains try to make sense of a complicated world. We see a simple tracksuit, and we think unimportant. We see a tailored suit, and we think powerful. We see a quiet demeanor, and we think weak. But as this story shows, the things we see on the surface rarely tell the whole story. The world is full of hidden masters, quiet geniuses, and everyday heroes disguised as ordinary people. True strength isn't about the clothes you wear, the car you drive, or how loudly you can shout. It's a quality of the spirit. It's the quiet confidence that comes from discipline. It's the courage to remain calm in the face of aggression. It's the wisdom to know that violence is the last resort of the incompetent, and that the greatest victory is not in defeating an opponent, but in uplifting them. Think about the people you interact with every day. The barista who serves you coffee, the janitor who cleans your office, the quiet person who sits next to you on your commute. Each one of them has a story. Each one of them has a hidden strength. Each one of them deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, not because of what they might be, but because of what they are, a fellow human being on this journey of life. The next time you are tempted to make a snap judgment, to dismiss someone because they don't fit your idea of success or importance, take a moment. Pause. Remember the story of Elena Vance. Remember that the most unassuming person in the room might just be the one with the most to teach you. What would you have done on that bus? Would you have been a silent witness, frozen by fear? Would you have been the kind witness, offering silent support? Or would you have been the one to stand up and say something? There are no easy answers. But asking the question is the first step towards becoming the kind of person you want to be. The world doesn't need more bullies like Marco. The world needs more people like Elena, people who cultivate an inner strength so profound that they have nothing to prove, people who understand that the gentle way is, in the end, the most powerful way of all. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And in the comments below, tell us about a time you witnessed an act of quiet strength, or a time you completely misjudged a book by its cover. Your story could be the one that inspires someone else. Because changing the world starts with changing ourselves, one small act of kindness and understanding at a time. Thank you for watching, and never forget to look for the strength that lies hidden in plain sight. The city continued its relentless rhythm, a symphony of sirens, traffic, and the ceaseless hum of human endeavor. For most, the story of the bus judoka faded into the background noise of a new news cycle, a brief and inspiring blip in the collective consciousness. But for the people whose lives were directly touched by that night, the ripples continued to expand, changing the landscape of their world in profound and lasting ways. For the young university student, the encounter was a catalyst. She took Elena's number and, with trembling hands, made the call. Stepping into the dojo for the first time was one of the most intimidating things she had ever done. But the moment she saw Elena's welcoming smile, her fear began to melt away. She discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, not just a physical ability to defend herself, but a deep, internal resilience. Her posture changed. She walked with her head held high, her gaze steady. She was no longer a person who was afraid of her own shadow. She was a woman who knew her own worth and was not afraid to take up space in the world. She became one of the dojo's most promising students, her academic mind perfectly suited to grasping the complex philosophy behind the physical techniques. She eventually helped Elena develop a curriculum for a women's self-empowerment workshop, combining the physical principles of judo with the psychological tools for building confidence and setting boundaries. The kind witness had found her own voice, and now she was teaching others how to find theirs. The impact on the transit authority was equally significant. George, the bus driver, became an internal advocate for change. He worked with his union and management to create a peer support program for drivers who experienced traumatic events on the job. The de-escalation training, designed with Elena's consultation, became a new standard, not just in their city, but in transit systems across the country. It focused on recognizing the signs of escalating conflict, using verbal techniques to diffuse tension, and understanding that the goal was to maintain a safe environment for everyone. The campaign featuring Elena's image was a massive success, humanizing the rules of public transit and fostering a renewed sense of shared responsibility among passengers. Ridership on the late-night routes, which had been declining due to safety concerns, began to tick upwards. People felt safer, not because of an increased police presence, but because of a cultural shift towards mutual respect. The bus itself became something of a local landmark. People would occasionally point out the small plaque to newcomers, recounting the story in hushed, reverent tones. It served as a constant, subtle reminder that heroism wasn't about capes and superpowers, but about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. The quiet dignity of one woman had, in a very real sense, made the entire city feel a little bit safer, a little bit kinder. And what of Elena? She shied away from the media spotlight, politely declining interviews and television appearances. She had no interest in fame or fortune. Her life's work was not in the public eye, but on the worn mats of her dojo, in the quiet, patient instruction of her students. Her days were long and filled with the demanding work of running the program, but she had never been happier. She saw the change not just in Marco, but in all the young men and women who walked through her doors. She saw them stand a little taller, speak a little more clearly, and treat each other with a newfound respect. She was not just teaching them how to fall, she was teaching them how to rise. She knew that she couldn't solve all the world's problems, she couldn't extinguish all the anger and violence, but she could create a small island of peace, a sanctuary where the principles of the gentle way could be planted and nurtured. She believed that the lessons learned in her dojo would be carried out into the world, like seeds on the wind, taking root in the most unexpected of places. One rainy afternoon, a new student appeared at the door. He was a young man, no older than 17, with angry eyes and a defiant posture that was all too familiar. He was there because a judge had sent him, another lost soul on the verge of being consumed by his own rage. He looked around the dojo with a cynical sneer, his arms crossed, his body language screaming that he did not want to be there. Elena felt a familiar sense of challenge, but also of hope. She walked over to him, her expression calm and welcoming. Marco, who was now an assistant instructor, came and stood beside her. The new student looked from Elena to Marco, sizing them up. He saw a middle-aged woman and a quiet young man. He saw weakness. Elena smiled gently. "Welcome," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of the ocean. "We have been waiting for you. Let's begin." The cycle would start anew, another life to be reshaped, another mind to be opened. The work was never done. And for Sensei Elena Vance, that was the entire point. The journey was the destination. The practice was the perfection. The gentle way was the only way forward. The philosophical underpinnings of Elena's teaching were rooted in the foundational texts of JUDO, but she had synthesized them into a practical code for modern urban life. She often told her students that the city itself was a powerful and unpredictable training partner. The crowded subway car was an exercise in maintaining one's center of balance. The aggressive driver cutting you off in traffic was a test of emotional control, an opportunity to yield rather than escalate. The dismissive bureaucrat behind a counter was a lesson in perseverance and the application of gentle, consistent pressure to overcome an obstacle. She encouraged her students to see every interaction not as a potential conflict, but as a chance to practice their art. "Judo is not something you do for 2 hours in the dojo," she would say, her voice resonating with a quiet passion. "It is something you live, every minute of every day. Your biggest opponent will never be a person on the mat. It will be your own ego, your own anger, your own fear. Master yourself, and no one can ever truly defeat you." This philosophy was what allowed Marco to finally break free from his past. He had once derived his sense of self-worth from the fear he could inspire in others. It was a fragile and fleeting source of power, one that required constant validation through acts of intimidation. Elena taught him to find a new source of power, one that came from within. It was the power of discipline, the quiet satisfaction of mastering a difficult technique after weeks of practice. It was the power of service, the fulfillment he felt when he helped a younger, struggling student finally understand a complex movement. He learned that lifting others up was a far more profound display of strength than pushing them down. His former friends, the ones who had been with him on the bus, could not understand his transformation. The second man, after his release, had fallen back into his old ways, his brief and painful encounter with Elena's skill doing nothing to alter his life's trajectory. The third, the one who had fled, was simply gone, a ghost who had vanished back into the city's anonymous depths. They had seen the technique, but they had not understood the principle. Marco, on the other hand, had been given a rare second chance, an opportunity to rebuild his life on a completely new foundation, and he had seized it with both hands. He began taking night classes at the local community college, studying to become a social worker. He wanted to work with at-risk youth, to be the person he had needed when he was a lost and angry teenager. He knew he could not change his past, but he was determined to use his experiences to shape a better future, not just for himself, but for others who were walking the same dangerous path. The dojo itself became a living, breathing entity, a community hub that was about much more than martial arts. Elena started a homework club for the younger students, a quiet space where they could study before practice. She organized weekend trips, taking the city kids out to the countryside to hike and connect with nature. She invited guest speakers, police officers, firefighters, successful business owners from the neighborhood, to talk to the students about careers and life choices. She was building a family, a support network for kids who often had none. The walls of the dojo became covered not with trophies and awards, but with photographs of the students, smiling during a summer picnic, looking proud after passing a school exam, standing with their arms around each other after a grueling but satisfying training session. These were the victories that mattered. The city officials who had initially been skeptical of her program became its most ardent supporters. They saw the tangible results: a decrease in juvenile crime in the neighborhood, an increase in graduation rates among the students in her program. The Gentle Way Forward was not just a feel-good story. It was a practical, effective model for community-based intervention. Elena Vance had proven that an investment in discipline, respect, and mutual welfare was far more effective than an investment in punishment and incarceration. The quiet warrior in the tracksuit had started a quiet revolution. One that was changing her city from the inside out, one student at a time. Her legacy would not be the medals she had won or the fight she had become famous for. It would be in the changed lives of the countless people who had learned from her that the most powerful force in the universe is not a clenched fist, but an open hand. The passage of years saw the dojo become an institution, a bedrock of the community. Elena, with her hair now streaked with graceful silver, remained its heart and soul. She moved with the same quiet efficiency, her technique honed to a level of near perfection, yet her greatest skill remained her boundless patience. She had trained a new generation of instructors, led by Marco, who was now a respected social worker and the dojo's head sensei. He embodied the transformative power of her teachings, his calm demeanor and empathetic approach, making him a powerful role model for the new waves of troubled youth who walked through their doors. The dojo had expanded, taking over the adjacent storefronts, but it never lost its humble, welcoming atmosphere. It was a place of peace in a world that often seemed to have none. One crisp autumn evening, an elderly woman stepped into the dojo. She moved slowly, with the aid of a cane, but her eyes were bright and clear. It was the young student from the bus, now a woman in her late 20s, a successful lawyer who did pro bono work for underprivileged families. She was not there to train. She was there to visit. She and Elena had remained close over the years, their bond forged in that moment of shared crisis. "I was arguing a case in court today," the young woman said, a warm smile on her face. "It was difficult. The opposing counsel was aggressive, trying to intimidate me, and I found myself thinking back to that night on the bus. I remembered the way you stood your ground, the calm in your eyes. And it gave me strength. I didn't raise my voice. I just calmly presented my facts. I used his own arguments against him. I won the case." She paused, her eyes welling up with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you, Elena, not just for teaching me how to defend myself, but for teaching me how to be strong in every part of my life. You changed my path forever." They embraced, a long and heartfelt hug that spoke volumes. It was a quiet moment, a testament to the enduring impact of a single encounter. The ripples from that night had not faded. They had become a powerful current, carrying people towards better versions of themselves. Later that evening, after the last class had ended and the dojo was quiet, Elena sat alone in the center of the mats. The city lights cast a warm glow through the large front windows. She thought about the endless chain of cause and effect, the way a single action could reverberate through time, touching countless lives in unforeseen ways. She had never sought to be a hero. She had only ever sought to live by her principles, to walk the gentle way. Yet, in doing so, she had become a quiet legend. Her story, a modern parable about the nature of true strength. The world was still a chaotic and often violent place. There would always be bullies, there would always be fear. But there would also always be people who chose a different path. People who chose discipline over rage, compassion over cruelty, and courage over apathy. The fight was never truly over. The work was never truly done. But as she looked around at the dojo she had built, at the faces in the photographs on the walls, at the legacy of peace and strength she had cultivated, Elena Vance knew, with a deep and abiding certainty, that it was a fight worth fighting. The gentle way was a difficult path, but it was a good one, and she would walk it until her very last day. The city's narrative is a tapestry woven from millions of individual threads, each representing a life, a story. For a brief period, the thread of Elena Vance had shone with a brilliant public light. But she had since allowed it to recede back into the intricate pattern, becoming a source of strength and color for the threads immediately around it. Her influence was no longer measured in headlines, but in the quiet confidence of a student, the reformed life of a former antagonist, and the safer passage of a stranger on a late-night bus. Her story became a kind of urban folklore, a tale told to remind people that the world is more than it appears on the surface. It was a reminder that the quiet dignity of an individual could be a revolutionary force, more powerful than any army. It challenged people's most basic assumptions about power, weakness, and the nature of conflict. The core lesson was one of profound irony. By refusing to fight on her opponent's terms, by using the gentle way, Elena had achieved the most complete and devastating victory imaginable. She had not just won a physical confrontation, she had won a moral one. She had not just defeated her attackers, she had laid the groundwork for one of them to be reborn. This was the ultimate expression of jita-kyoe, or mutual welfare and benefit. Even in defending herself, she had created an outcome that ultimately benefited her attacker, setting him on a path to a better life. It was a concept that was difficult for many to grasp, a radical form of empathy that saw even an aggressor as a human being who had lost their way. But it was the cornerstone of her entire philosophy. She taught her students that every person they met was engaged in a great struggle, and that a response of compassion, even when firm boundaries were necessary, was always superior to a response of hatred. The dojo continued to be a testament to this belief. It was a microcosm of the world Elena wished to see, a place where people from all walks of life, different races, different backgrounds, different ages came together with a shared purpose. On the mats, the external labels of society fell away. There was no rich or poor, no powerful or weak. There were only students, partners in a shared journey of self-discovery and improvement. The rhythmic slap of feet on the tatami, the grunts of effort, the shared laughter after a difficult drill, these were the sounds of a community being built, one throw, one hold, one bow at a time. Marco, now in his early 30s, had become a man of quiet gravitas. The anger that had once fueled him had been transmuted into a powerful passion for helping others. He often shared his own story with new students, not with pride, but with a raw and humbling honesty. He told them of his anger, his insecurity, and the night he had mistaken a master's tranquility for a victim's fear. "I thought strength was about making people afraid of you," he would say, his voice steady. "Sensei Vance taught me that real strength is about making people feel safe with you." His testimony was more powerful than any lecture. The young people in his charge saw in him the living proof that change was possible, that their past mistakes did not have to define their future. He was a beacon of hope, his life a testament to the redemptive power of discipline and second chances. Elena's influence had created a virtuous cycle, a self-perpetuating engine of positive change that would continue long after she was gone. She had not just taught individuals, she had taught teachers, ensuring that the principles of the gentle way would be passed down from one generation to the next. The legacy of the bus judoka was not a single, static event. It was a living, breathing thing. A network of changed lives that continued to spread outwards, touching the city in ways both seen and unseen. It was the quiet courage of 1,000 people, inspired by one, to choose a better way. The seasons continued to turn, painting the city in the vibrant hues of autumn and the stark whites of winter. Inside the dojo, the eternal spring of learning and growth never faded. Elena, now approaching an age where many would have retired, seemed to draw energy from her teaching. Her movements were perhaps a fraction slower, but they were infused with a wisdom and an efficiency that was breathtaking to watch. She could still control an opponent twice her size with the barest of movements, a subtle shift of weight, a perfectly timed turn of the wrist. Her judo had become a form of calligraphy, each technique a brushstroke that was both aesthetically beautiful and perfectly functional. She had become a living embodiment of Seiryoku Zenyo, achieving the maximum effect with the minimum of effort. One day, a television crew arrived at the dojo. They were producing a documentary series called Urban Legends, profiling real-life stories that had become part of the city's modern folklore. They wanted to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the bus incident, to retell the story for a new generation. Elena politely, but firmly, declined to be interviewed on camera. "The story is not about me," she told the producer. "It is about the principles. If you want to understand what happened that night, watch the students in this class. Watch how they help each other. Watch how they respect each other. The answer is in what we do here every day, not in what I did once, 10 years ago." The producer, initially disappointed, began to understand. He turned his cameras away from Elena and towards the class. He filmed the young children learning to fall without fear. He filmed the teenagers practicing a complex throw, a dance of balance and leverage. He filmed Marco patiently guiding a new student, his voice a low and encouraging murmur. And he interviewed the students themselves. They didn't talk about fighting. They talked about confidence, about focus, about family. They talked about how the dojo had changed their lives, given them a sense of purpose, and taught them how to be better people. The documentary that aired was not the sensationalist action story the network had probably expected. It was a quiet, contemplative film about the power of community, discipline, and the profound impact of a single, dedicated teacher. It ended with a shot of the dojo at dusk, the students bowing to each other in a gesture of mutual respect, their white uniforms a stark contrast to the darkening city streets outside. The final voiceover did not belong to a narrator, but to the lawyer, the former kind witness, who had agreed to speak. "We all want a hero to save us," she said, "but the lesson of Elena Vance is that we have to become our own heroes." She didn't just win a fight. She showed us a way to live, a gentler way. And that has made all the difference. The film was a quiet success, winning awards for its poignant and inspirational message. It introduced the story to a new generation, ensuring that the legacy of the bus judoka would continue to inspire. For Elena, life went on as it always had. The next day, she was the first to arrive at the dojo, sweeping the mats, preparing for the day's classes, ready to greet the next student who walked through the door seeking the strength to navigate the often unforgiving dojo of the world. Her work was her reward. Her students, her legacy. The quiet revolution continued. As the years advanced, the physical dojo became just one manifestation of a much larger idea. The Gentle Way Forward became a foundation, a non-profit organization managed by a board that included Marco, the lawyer she had inspired, and several respected community leaders. The foundation's mission was to fund and support similar programs across the nation, spreading the philosophy that had transformed their own neighborhood. They developed curricula, trained instructors, and provided grants to community centers in other cities, allowing the seeds planted in one small dojo to take root in distant and disparate soils. Elena, while serving as the foundation's guiding spirit, remained firmly planted on her own tatami. She had no interest in becoming an administrator or a public figure. Her place was with her students, her hands-on approach the very essence of her teaching. She believed that true change happened at the individual level, in the quiet moments of breakthrough when a student finally understood a principle not just with their mind, but with their entire body. The story of that night on the bus had now transcended its specific details. It had become a parable, a teaching tool that Marco and the other instructors used to explain the core tenets of their art. The bus was a metaphor for life's unexpected challenges. The bullies represented the internal and external forces of aggression and negativity that everyone faces. Elena's response was the embodiment of the judo philosophy. Do not meet force with force, yield, blend. Redirect the negative energy until it exhausts itself. It was a lesson in emotional and psychological self-defense, far more valuable than any physical technique. They taught the students that the goal was not to be invincible, but to be unthrowable, to have a core of inner balance so strong that no amount of external chaos could knock them off their center. This inner strength was the ultimate defense against the fear and intimidation that Marco had once wielded. The foundation also created a scholarship fund, helping promising students from the program attend college. They had sent dozens of young men and women to universities, where they studied to become doctors, engineers, artists, and, in several cases, social workers and teachers, continuing the cycle of giving back to their communities. The quiet woman in the tracksuit had, through her unwavering dedication, created a powerful engine of social mobility and positive change. One evening, a man in his late 20s walked into the dojo. He was well dressed, in a sharp suit, and carried a briefcase. He looked out of place, and Marco approached him cautiously. The man looked at Marco, then around the bustling dojo, and a look of profound disbelief crossed his face. I don't know if you remember me," the man stammered. "My name is, it doesn't matter. I was on the bus that night. The one who ran away." It was the third antagonist, the coward who had fled into the night. Marco stared at him, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then a slow smile of understanding spread across his face. "I remember," Marco said simply, extending a hand. "Welcome back." The man explained that he had been haunted by that night for years. The shame of his cowardice and the awe of what he had witnessed had never left him. He had straightened out his life, gone to business school, and had become successful, but he had always felt a void, a sense of unfinished business. He had read about the foundation, about the work they were doing, and he felt compelled to return. He opened his briefcase and took out a checkbook. He wrote a check to the foundation, a donation with enough zeros to fund their operations for an entire year. "This is not for forgiveness," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve that. This is for balance, to try and put some good back into the world, to balance out the bad I did, what she did, what you're doing here. It's important." Elena had been watching from across the room. She walked over, and the man flinched, still seeing her as the unstoppable force from his nightmares. She simply placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Everyone's journey is different," she said, her voice filled with a profound and unconditional acceptance. "The important thing is not where you started, but the direction you are facing now. Thank you for your contribution. It will help many people." In that moment, the final thread of the story was woven into the tapestry. Redemption, it turned out, came in many forms. It could be found in a lifetime of service, like Marco's. Or it could be found in a single, heartfelt act of restitution. The gentle way had room for them all. The circle was now complete. Every actor from that fateful night, having found their own way to a form of peace. The dojo stood as a quiet monument to a living philosophy. It was more than a building. It was a promise. It was a promise to the community that there was a safe place for their children. It was a promise to the students that they could become more than they ever thought possible. And it was a promise to the world that a different way was possible, a way based on respect, discipline, and mutual welfare. Elena Vance, in her later years, became something of a living treasure. A quiet matriarch to a sprawling family of her own making. She had never married, never had children of her own, but she had been a mother figure to hundreds. Her students, now grown and with families of their own, would bring their children to the dojo to learn from the woman who had taught them so much more than how to throw. The story of the bus incident was now told to these new young students not as a violent tale, but as a creation myth. It was the story of how their dojo, their community, had been born from a single moment of conflict that had been transformed, through skill and wisdom, into a lasting peace. They learned that their sensei was not a fighter, but a peacemaker, and that the greatest strength she possessed was not in her hands, but in her heart. On the 20th anniversary of that night, a small private gathering was held at the dojo. There was no media, no politicians. It was just the students, past and present, the people whose lives had been shaped within those walls. Marco, now a graying and respected leader, stood to speak. He didn't recount the fight. He spoke of the lessons, of the patience, of the unwavering belief that Elena had shown in him when he had not believed in himself. He spoke of the thousands of lives that had been bettered, the cycles of violence that had been broken, because one woman chose to live by her principles. At the end of his speech, he turned to Elena, who was sitting quietly in her usual spot, and he, along with every person in the room, bowed deeply. It was not a bow of ritual, but a profound expression of love, gratitude, and reverence. Elena looked out at the sea of faces, the lawyer, the former coward, the countless students she had guided, and she saw not a legacy of her own making, but a beautiful, intricate web of human connection. The gentle way had not just been her path, it had become their path. The single stone she had thrown into the dark waters of the world that night had created ripples, which had become waves, which had now become a quiet, steady tide, lifting everyone it touched. The unassuming woman in the tracksuit had done more than win a fight on a bus. She had shown an entire city the strength of gentleness, the power of peace, and the enduring truth that the best way to change the world is to start by changing yourself. Her work was done. Her lesson was immortal. The city, ever-changing, held the story of Elena Vance in its heart. It became a piece of its identity, a reference point for what was possible. When people spoke of courage, they spoke of her. When they spoke of redemption, they spoke of Marco. When they spoke of community, they spoke of the dojo. It was a story that reminded them that heroes were not mythical beings from comic books, but real people, often quiet and unassuming, who, when faced with a choice, choose to act with integrity and skill. It taught them that a single moment of standing up to injustice could have consequences that spanned decades, creating positive change that could never have been anticipated. The foundation, the Gentle Way Forward, had become a national organization, a testament to the power of a single, well-executed idea. It had touched the lives of tens of thousands of at-risk youth, creating a network of dojos that were not just about martial arts, but about character development. The curriculum, refined over years, was a masterclass in turning conflict into connection and aggression into aspiration. Elena's principles had been codified and replicated, but the magic of her personal touch, her quiet and profound presence, was something unique to the original dojo, which was now a designated historic landmark. Visitors from around the world would come, not to see a monument of brick and mortar, but to feel the atmosphere of peace and purpose that she had cultivated. They would watch the classes, see the seamless interaction between students of all ages, and understand that they were witnessing something special, a working model of a more harmonious society. In her final years, Elena spent less time teaching the physical techniques and more time in quiet conversation with the students, sharing the philosophical and moral dimensions of her art. She would speak of the unbendable arm, a concept from Aikido, another martial art she respected. The idea was that an arm, when extended with the full belief and intention that it was part of the unmovable universe, could not be bent by force. This, she explained, was the true nature of inner strength. It was not about muscle, but about a deep, unshakable connection to one's own principles. Be unbendable in your kindness, she would tell them. Be unbendable in your integrity. Be unbendable in your compassion. If you build your life on this foundation, no one can ever throw you. Her passing was a quiet affair. Just as she would have wanted, there was no grand public funeral, but a simple, heartfelt memorial at the dojo. Thousands of people, from all walks of life, attended. They were the living testament to her life's work. They did not mourn her death. They celebrated her life by rededicating themselves to the principles she had taught them. The dojo did not falter. Marco, and the generation of instructors she had trained, carried the torch forward. The spirit of Elena Vance was infused in the very walls of the building, in the worn texture of the mats, and in the heart of every student who bowed upon entering. The story of the bus, the catalyst for it all, had become a legend, a powerful reminder that from a moment of ugliness, something beautiful and lasting could grow. It was a testament to the fact that true strength is not the ability to break others, but the ability to mend what is broken, starting with oneself. The quiet warrior was gone, but the gentle way was now a powerful and enduring force in the world. A lasting gift from the unassuming woman who had simply wanted to get home on the bus one night. The essence of Elena's legacy was its scalability. It was not a cult of personality built around a single charismatic individual, but a transferable system of ethics and practices. This was her true genius. She had created a franchise of hope, a model that could be adopted and adapted by any community. The core of the model was the deep understanding that young people, especially those prone to aggression, were not in need of more punishment, but of a new and better definition of strength. The street culture they came from defined strength as dominance, disrespect, and the willingness to inflict violence. Elena's dojo offered a compelling and, crucially, more effective alternative. It showed them, in tangible physical terms, that a smaller, weaker person using technique and timing could overcome a larger, stronger person relying on brute force. This was a revelation. It deconstructed their entire worldview. Once they accepted this physical truth, they became open to the moral and ethical truths that accompanied it. They learned that true power was control, not chaos. They learned that respect was earned through humility, not demanded through fear. The physical practice of judo was the hook, the thing that drew them in, but the lessons in character were the true substance of the program. Marco, in his role as the head of the foundation, often traveled to new dojos that were adopting their program. He would tell them that their first job was not to teach throws, but to create a sanctuary. This room, he would say, gesturing to the training hall, must be the safest place in these kids' lives, a place with clear rules, absolute consistency, and unconditional positive regard. They have chaos in their homes, chaos on the streets. Here, they must find order. Here, they must find peace. Only then can they begin to find it within themselves. This focus on creating a safe and structured environment was key to their success. The rituals of judo, the bowing, the meticulous folding of the uniform, the cleaning of the mats were not empty gestures. They were a form of moving meditation, a way of teaching mindfulness and respect for oneself, one's partners, and one's environment. For young people whose lives were often disorderly and unpredictable, these rituals provided a powerful sense of stability and purpose. The foundation also funded research, partnering with universities to study the neurological and psychological effects of their program. The studies showed remarkable results. Participants demonstrated significant improvements in emotional regulation, impulse control, empathy, and academic performance. They were scientifically proving what Elena had always known intuitively, that the discipline and philosophy of the martial arts, when taught correctly, could be a powerful tool for healing trauma and building resilient, well-adjusted human beings. The story of the bus incident was the emotional core that fueled the entire enterprise. It was the perfect parable, a real-world demonstration of every principle they taught. It provided an answer to the inevitable question from skeptical kids, when would I ever use this? The answer was, every day. You use it to stay calm when someone insults you. You use it to have the confidence to walk away from a fight. And if you ever have no other choice, you use it to protect yourself or others with quiet efficiency, not anger. Elena Vance had provided the world with a blueprint for turning conflict into growth. She had taken the ancient art of judo and made it relevant and vital for the challenges of the modern world. Her legacy was not just in the past, in the memory of a single heroic act, but in the future, in the potential of every new student who stepped onto the mats, ready to learn the gentle way. The enduring power of Elena's story lay in its universal theme of hidden potential. It resonated with everyone who had ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or judged by their appearance. She was a symbol for the quiet, competent people of the world, the ones who do not advertise their strengths but simply possess them. Her story was a quiet affirmation that substance will always, in the end, triumph over style. It was a moral tale for an age obsessed with surfaces, a reminder that true worth lies beneath. This was why her story continued to be told, not just in documentaries, but by parents to their children, by teachers to their students, by mentors to their mentees. It had become a modern fable, as essential and timeless as any of Aesop's. The characters had become archetypes: the humble master, the arrogant bully, the redeemed disciple, the inspired witness. Each character represented a choice, a path that one could take in life. Do you choose to judge and intimidate? Do you choose to stand by in silent fear? Or do you choose to cultivate an inner strength, to be a quiet force for good in the world? The dojo, now a world-renowned institution, had a long waiting list. But its mission had never changed. It was still focused on the local kids, the ones who needed it most. Marco ensured that the core of their student body would always be the at-risk youth from the surrounding neighborhoods. The scholarships and grants from the foundation made this possible, creating a sustainable model that was independent of the students' ability to pay. They had, in effect, created a privately funded, highly effective alternative to the juvenile justice system. One final story, often told by Marco, perfectly encapsulated the reach of Elena's influence. A young woman in another city, a graduate of one of the foundation's sponsored dojos, found herself cornered in a subway station by a threatening man. She did not fight him. Instead, she used her calm, confident posture and a firm, de-escalating verbal technique she had learned, a technique directly modeled on Elena's methods. She created a space of non-aggression, confusing the attacker's expectation of a fearful victim. He became flustered and retreated. She had won a conflict without ever laying a hand on her opponent. When she told her instructor about it, she said, "I just channeled my inner Elena Vance." This was the true legacy. Her name had become synonymous with a certain kind of strength, a quiet, intelligent power that was accessible to everyone. She had not just taught people how to fight, she had taught them how not to fight. She had shown them that the greatest power is the power to transform a situation, to turn a potential moment of violence into a moment of peace. From a single, ugly confrontation on a city bus, a global movement dedicated to peace, discipline, and mutual welfare had been born. It was a profound and lasting victory, a testament to the enduring power of the gentle way, and a final, quiet bow to the unassuming master who had shown the world its true meaning.